Hi-ho, Lance Schooler, the Savvy Navigator again. In part 2 of this special 2-hour edition of Down Under the Radar, I'm talking to Geoff Stone about our belief systems. We discuss the way we come up with our own belief systems and what impact our belief systems have on our own path to success. Here's Geoff now.
One of the things that fascinates me about all of us and the way we think and behave is the way we come up with our own belief systems. Now, the interesting thing about belief systems is that they're not yours. I don't think many people don't realise they're not yours. They come from somebody else. Because, take my case, I'm born a Pom. My dad was an arch conservative. In other words, Liberal Party for Australia and so on and so forth. And so what do I grow up as? I grow up like him. His belief systems he passes on to me. And when you go to school, for example, you want to be part of the pack, don't you? And if you're going to be part of the pack, you're going to do what everybody else does. And as you get older, you find the same thing happens. It gets more so, in fact, because when you get into your teenage years, the same thing happens, especially with the girls. I don't know about the fellas, but the girls have all got to have the makeup and all the gear and all the rest of it. And usually these days you find they've got their own way of talking, their own language, all that sort of stuff. Now that's all created from somewhere else. They haven't created it, it's happened to them. If at school somebody says, Lance, you will never write a book. There is no way on God's earth. It will stick in your mind, and eventually you will say, well, no, it's one of those things I can't do. In fact, somebody did say that to me. One of my teachers years ago said to me when I was quite a kid, Stone, that is the biggest heap of rubbish I think I've ever read. And I was writing the first chapter of my a crime book, you see. And he just said it was rubbish. Do you know, I remembered that for years afterwards. And what have I done with most of my life? Write and speak. So, but these things stick. All the other things tend to stick as well. You find that you think of one belief system you've got that you got because it was you and you alone. Even if you believe in God, or you believe in a church, or you believe in a religion, where'd you get it from? Did you come up with it? No, the answer is no. You got it from somewhere else. So our belief system can either be very powerful and good for us, or they can be a pain in the butt. The ones that are a pain in the butt are the ones that are negative. The ones that say, no, you couldn't possibly do that. Well, our family never did make any money, and so, I mean, that's the way we are, isn't it? So we're not going to make any money in this lifetime, and you certainly won't, Geoffrey, because, well, it's not us, is it, you see? But the trouble with all this is that having got these belief systems, we now accept them as part of us. But you don't have to keep the ones that aren't any good. You can get rid of them. So that's the first step, that you have to get people to understand that the beliefs they've got and the attitudes they've got really and truly didn't start with them. We've absorbed them over a period of time. Keep the good ones, but get shot of the bad ones. And then people say, but I can't do that, you know. I mean, a lot of people say to me in public speaking, they say, well, it's all right for you because you've been talking for years and you've been talking to thousands of people and it's easy for you. It's not like that for us. And I say to them, yeah, but I was like you once. I was in exactly the same position you were. So don't think you're anything special. And in any way, as I've said on more than one occasion, I don't know anybody who started life being good at public speaking. I just haven't met anybody. They all had to start the hard way. And they all had to start by thinking they weren't any good. See, that's the next step in this particular line of thinking. A lot of your beliefs tell you the things you can't do. And a lot of the reasons why you can't. For example, it's changing now, thank goodness. But there was a time when working class lads, no matter what country you came from, would never aspire to go to a university. And anyway, if they did, Dad would say, don't want that rubbish. What do you want to go there for? Now, what you want to do is be a plumber. You know, plumbers make a lot of money. Well, actually, today that's very true. But the point is that it was not one of those things that you did. Thank God it's changing, because now you can do pretty much what you want to do. And I think that that's an important element that we all have going in our heads. And we have all these things we know that we shouldn't do and can't do and so on and so forth. And so we've developed words to cover that. I ought to do this. In other words, I don't want to, but I ought to. I should do this. Same thing. I should do this, but I really would rather not. And we got lots of this. I never could do this. Never is another word. Always is another word. I always get it wrong. Now, if you keep talking to your little inner self like that, your inner self is, bless its little heart, it's got a subconscious mind. If you think about subconscious minds, can you remember the first day you started to drive a motor car and you had somebody sitting next to you and you got L plates on and you came up to a junction, you're approaching a junction, you had to make a right-hand turn. And let's go back in time a bit when you had gearboxes and gears to change and even trafficators to put on. And so you had brakes to contend with. You had to look in the mirror to see what's behind you. You had to make sure there was nothing ahead, and then you had to look down the side street as well. You had to come to a stop, probably put it back into neutral and then into first. Oh boy, and then drive around the corner if it's clear. Do you do that now? No way. It is so much a part of automatic thinking that you just come up to the corner, you've automatically checked front, back and all the rest of it. You know what the car's going to do. You don't even say to yourself, I've got to turn the wheel 3/4 to the right. You don't do any of that. It's automatic. Now, a lot of our thinking goes that way. A lot of our thinking is automatic thinking. And it's all right if it's good automatic thinking, but what if it's not? What if it's the kind of thinking that keeps telling you that you can't do it, you haven't got the skills, etc., etc., etc. And so, under those circumstances, you'll run into trouble. I've met a number of people who've never accepted the fact that they got things wrong or couldn't do them. And I'll give you one or two just for a quick example. I once met and interviewed a man called Douglas Bader, who lost both his legs in an air crash in 1933. He was doing silly things, flying upside down, 50 feet above the runway, and he miscued, went into the ground and lost both his legs. As he was lying there in bed, the nurse outside, he heard her say, "Shh, quiet, there's a boy in there dying." And it suddenly registered, and he thought, "I'm not bloody dying," and sort of pulled himself out of it and came back almost to living again, and it suddenly hurt a lot. He then discovered that he couldn't fly again, he couldn't do anything again, but he was determined he was going to walk. Eventually they gave him tin legs. From the tin legs, he was determined. Nobody walked before with tin legs. I mean, not his size of tin legs. He finally managed to walk. He then started playing golf and kept falling over. But in fact, he ended up as a crack golfer. He could drive a car without too much trouble. And even when he was recuperating, it took three of them to drive his old Bentley. One to steer, one to use the clutch on the foot brake, and I don't know what he did. I think he just pushed the accelerator, sideways. Anyway, the point was that they gradually taught themselves to do things. Then came 1939, 1940, and he wanted to fly again. And of course he applied to the Air Ministry, and they said, "Douglas, dear boy, you can't fly without legs." And Douglas was determined he would. And he happened to have a pal who didn't actually own the airfield, but ran one. And there were a couple of 3 Spitfires hanging around, so he went down and conned this bloke into letting him fly a Spitfire. Now, imagine a bloke with no legs coming up to you and saying, "Excuse me, do you mind if I borrow a £5,000 Spitfire?" Which was a lot of money then, because I'm sure I can fly it. Anyway, he did fly it, and when he landed, he took his logbook with him, and he said to this bloke who ran the place, he said, "Sign that. 1 hour solo this Spitfire." He then went back to the Air Ministry, and they didn't believe it. He said, "Well, check, I've done it." Anyhow, to cut a long story short, they finally said, "Oh, all right, come on then, you can fly Spitfires." I won't go on with the rest of the story except to say he became a famous pilot. He was a fighter pilot and eventually was shot down over Germany, and he bailed out, but he couldn't get his feet out because they were trapped under the rudder pedal. He was going down at a great rate of knots, and so he just unstrapped his legs and leapt out of the aircraft and landed on the ground. And here he is in British battle dress, a row of ribbons. He got it wasn't air combat, it was group captain rings round him. And the Germans picked him up and thought it was a joke, you see. But the Luftwaffe knew about him. They took him over and gave him some tea, coffee and whatever it is the Germans did, and allowed the RAF to drop him a set of legs. So the RAF dropped him a set of legs. And as soon as he got them, he tried 3 times to escape. And then eventually what happened, they went back again and they said, sorry, Douglas, except in German, and they said, we're taking your legs away every night. So he didn't get back to Britain until the end of the war. What incredible determination.
That was the film...
Reach for the Sky, they turned it into a film.
As a boy.
Yeah. Now, he's not the only one. I've met lots of them.
Reminds me of Janine Shepherd.
Janine Shepherd, that's right. Another one. You know, she's riding bicycle up in the Blue Mountains in Australia, and suddenly a truck writes her off, and they think she's dying. And she's broken nearly every bone in her body, she's got internal damage, and so on and so forth. Again, cut a long story short, she eventually manages to start walking. Although everybody said, you'll never walk again, you'll never have children, you know, you're just going to have to do a rethink. Anyway, she decided she was going to walk again. I met her some years after all that had happened, and I was expecting somebody to either turn up in a wheelchair or with crutches. But no, there was this young woman walking very sprightly, and she came down and I said, where's your crutches? She said, oh dear boy, I don't need those, I've just had an oil and grease at the hospital. That sort of thing. Anyway, it turns out now she walks very well indeed. She's an author, she's written 2 books, Never Tell Me Never is one of them. Right, yeah. She is a qualified pilot, she's a commercial pilot, she also teaches aerobatics, and she's married, and she has 2 of her own children. And if you think of Never Tell Me Never, that's the attitude.
Exactly.
In other words, they don't go down that track. Now, she's nothing special. Bada was nothing special, and there are a few others that I've met in my time who've done the same thing. It's all a mental attitude. If you're prepared to put up with it and suffer, well, you will. But if you're not prepared to put up and suffer, sure, it's going to be hard work, but if you've got the determination, you'll get through it and out the other side. So all this business of the way we think is entirely up to us. In your business of exporting, for example, not an easy thing to do, is it really?
No, it's not, but it's the same thing, and it's funny to talk about the car analogy. I've been using that in recent times to explain to people, import-export, no, it's not necessarily easy. Just like driving a car isn't easy when you don't know how to drive one.
That's exactly right.
But once you learn, as you well put it, it goes onto automatic. And oftentimes I'm driving down the road, deep in thought, and all of a sudden you think, where did the last 10 minutes,
that's
20
right,
or half an hour go?
Yes.
And did I go through any red lights? And what happened to all those hairpin bends?
Right.
You've just done it automatically.
That's right.
And it's amazing.
Yeah.
And so the thing is, from what you're saying, is that if we think we can't, we can't. If we think we can, we can. So if we want to get into business, and if it's import-export business, we've just got to find the way to do it, just like learning to drive a car.
That's exactly
the clutch, the brake, the lights, all those things. Find out what the procedure is, and then learn it, and then it will become automatic.
Well, that's perfectly true, and hopefully correctly automatic.
Exactly.
See, but you can do something about it. And one of the things that you can do, and in fact I say to most of the people that come to my workshops, for the next week you're going to have to spend without having a single negative thought. And they all fall about laughing, because it's not possible, is it? I mean, go a week without a negative thought. I actually met somebody once who said they had been a week without a negative thought, but I didn't believe them, because you can't. But what you have to learn to do to begin with is to recognise the negative thought when it comes into your head. Leave it and it'll start festering. So you've got to spend a whole week without a negative thought. Now, as I say, I've just said it's impossible to do that. But what you're really meant to do is to recognise them when they hit you. Because once you've recognised them, you can do something about it. And I'll tell you what you can do about it. The very first thing you do is recognise that you've just had a negative thought, and then I write it down. Because the minute you put it down on a piece of paper, for some reason you can focus more clearly on it. If you leave it up there in your head, like for example, you've just gone down the road and you've left the gas on. Did I leave the gas on? Oh heck. And I'm sure there was a dishcloth hanging over the... Oh my goodness. Suddenly it gets bigger and bigger as a problem, doesn't it?
That's right.
And now, and it's all ridiculous really, but just the same, it's there. And so your little negative thought gets bigger and bigger and bigger and becomes more and more of a problem. Have one at 3 o'clock in the morning and you won't go back to sleep, that kind of thing. So the first thing you do is write the thing down and challenge it. Is this really true? Is it really a big problem? Because half the time it isn't. And anyway, if you were wide awake, you probably wouldn't find that it was too serious a problem. And maybe it's not something you need to deal with tomorrow. Perhaps it's just something, did I pay that last gas bill? Well, if you didn't, you can't do it at 3 o'clock in the morning anyway. So all you have to do tomorrow morning is ring up the gas company if you can't find the bill and ask them. And then apologise if you're late. Usually they'll accept that. So at least you recognise it, you challenge it, and then you turn it into a positive in some way. Now the positive for something like you've forgotten is make a mental note you're not going to do it again, or write a big note on the piece of paper, do not forget to. That's one way of going about it. Another way, actually, I taught my doctor this, because he often worries about his patients. He never worries about me, but never mind. And I said to him, if you find it difficult to do something about it, put some elastic bands on your wrist, and as soon as you get a negative thought that you've recognised, go twang, because that'll sting and that'll stop thinking you of the negative thought. You'll start worrying about the fact you hurt yourself a bit. Because once you've done that, then you've broken the pattern of thinking. Now you can start changing the thought process. And even if it is a problem, it doesn't really matter. We all have problems through our lives, don't we? There's no point in dwelling on the problem, because all you're going to do is make it worse. You think about it. The minute you stay with the problem, all you're doing is becoming more and more and more involved in the problem. What you need to do is see if there's something you can do about it. For example, supposing you looked at the problem and said, I wonder if there's an opportunity buried in there somewhere. Or, I wonder if I can learn something from this. Or I wonder if there's somebody who can help me with this. They're all much more positive thoughts. And the minute you start working down those tracks, you find the burden goes, to a large extent, leaves you, because you're now doing something active and positive. So that's one of the first things you do about negative thoughts. You'll find you'll always get them. You can never get rid of them.
That's right.
But on the other hand, if you get used to this pattern of doing it this way, I get them still, but they don't bother me anymore. In fact, I know if I did it in the street, I'd get arrested, but sometimes I get a negative thought coming into my head, and I just tell my negative thought, I say, get the hell out of here, I don't want to talk to you. Come back when you've got something positive to tell me, you see? If you did that in the street, people would think you were nuts, and they probably do think I'm nuts anyhow. But it works, it really does. It's your subconscious mind gathering a few thoughts together and whacking them in and saying, by the way. And it will also do the same thing when it comes to, say, in my case, public speaking. The reason that people have a problem standing up and making a speech is the probability is somewhere in their life they stood up and they tried to make a speech and they hated it or they failed at it or whatever. Now your subconscious mind is there to help you not make more mistakes. What better way to do it than to turn around and say to you mentally, oi, I wouldn't do that if I were you. You know you can't do it. You know you stuffed it up last time. And if you keep on getting that thought, you will never ever overcome the problem. So what you need to do is to be able to tell it to go and jump in the lake, that thought. You don't need it. If you now need a positive thought. And that one's not too difficult to do. You can say to yourself, and I've done this many times with groups of people, I say, okay, you reckon you can't stand up and speak. Well, let's imagine now you're not having to make a speech or a presentation, but you're sitting down and you're having a cup of coffee with your friends and you're telling them about what you've got to do tomorrow when you get into the office. Do you get upset and uptight? And the answer is no, they don't.
No.
They don't because they're not standing up, there's no pressure, they're talking to people they know. So the reality is that you don't have to behave like that. You're behaving like that because you suddenly think, I've got to stand up. And when I stand up, people are going to look at me. Well, heavens above, where else are they going to look? If they started looking at the ceiling, you'd worry about that, wouldn't you? So you get used to that idea that you're going to be looked at. But the next thing that happens, because again, it's all this thought process, people then say, but I'm not interested. They're not interested in what I'm talking about. What if I forget anything? They're bored. I know they don't like me by the look on their faces, because most people in repose don't smile. They don't look happy at all. So you're going to be faced, in my case, with an audience that's looking glum. And so you make the assumption wrongly, because you're now reading what's in their heads. Oh, come on. How can you... I don't know what you're thinking right now, any more than I half knows what I'm thinking myself. But Do you see, you don't know what other people are thinking, so why think negative? Why not think, okay, I've got a gift I'm giving them. That's a gift of information that's going to help them make better speeches and so on. Isn't it better to go down that track than it is to imagine immediately, because of the looks on their faces, they don't like you?
Now, that's obviously relevant to public speaking, but let's twist that around and say in import-export, basically that's about buying and selling.
Yes.
We're talking about people selling products to other people or buying, purchasing.
Yes.
We come down to negotiation.
That's right.
And we're in a similar situation. People thinking of selling often think, and I've had many people at my courses, when I say, remember, when you import something, you probably will import it from overseas, you'll have to deal with someone to purchase it, but then when it gets to Australia, or whichever country you're importing it to, you're then probably going to sell it to somebody else.
Yes.
And so you're going to have to make a sale, whether that's going to be in person, like you and I are talking now, and or talking to someone over a phone, like someone at the end of this audio conversation, or through an email or a letter or something like that. You've still got to put a point of view, but everyone seems to go into, not everyone, so I've used one of those general words.
You'll forgive me.
But we're talking about sales. I had a lady at a course, and she just said, "I won't be a good salesperson."
Yes.
I said, "But you explain things well when we're talking face to face." And she said, "But that's not selling." I said, "Yes, it is."
You're precisely right.
And it comes down, I guess, I use the analogy, do you see a movie, actually tonight we'll probably go and see the Da Vinci Code. But you see a movie and you say, I've seen a movie and it's been really great. You talk to friends or people, you might be at a party or wherever, and you're talking to people, and as a result of you passing on a good recommendation, that person goes off and goes
sees
to the movie.
That's right.
And I said, now you should go and get a commission from Greater Union or Fleets, because you've actually just sold a seat at the theatre.
That's absolutely right.
That's selling.
Yes, it is.
It's just influencing people to make an action.
Yeah, you're absolutely right about that. Because in fact, when you're selling, stop thinking about selling something to somebody. Start thinking about meeting somebody's needs.
Exactly.
Or solving somebody's problem. Because if you approach it that way, you'll find that you don't have any problems. Because you're really genuinely trying to help them make their life and their business better. But if you go the other way around and you say, my job is to sell it to you whether you like it or not, because your sales director is sitting behind you or something like that, then you're going to have a problem. But the real salesman these days meets a need, solves a problem. And that's what you're really trying to do, which means you need to know something about the people you're talking to.
Exactly.
And if you
put
don't,
yourself in their shoes.
Yes, that's right. And it's
sometimes it's in the galoshes
yes.
or Ugg boots.
Well, that's right. It doesn't really matter, but the point is, I'm a great believer in finding out something about people's needs before ever I go and talk to them about something. Because if you don't do that, you might... I once had to make a speech, and it was all about people in television, that sort of thing. And the president stood up and introduced this Geoff Stone fellow, and he's here tonight to talk to you about the world of television. And then somebody at the back said, haven't you built a cement boat? And I said, well, yes, I have, as a matter of fact. He said, well, why don't you tell us about cement boats instead? And suddenly I got a cheer from the rest of them, all a bunch of blokes. And so I said, would you really rather hear about cement boats? And he said, yeah. So I did. I spent the evening talking about how to build a cement boat. I know it sounds crazy, and most people think, doesn't cement sink? Well, it doesn't sink any faster than a big steel boat does. But it was an Italian idea in the 1930s. And in fact, one of our Sydney Hobarters was a cement boat. It was Helsel. It was a boat owned by Sid Fisher.
That's right. Yeah.
And he had one of those for some years. So you can't tell what's in people's minds unless they actually tell you. Otherwise, you go ahead and do what you're supposed to do and believe that you're giving a gift of information to the people that you're talking to. Do it that way and you can't go very far wrong.
And I read it somewhere, market research. Best way of getting market research is just asking your customers or your clients or potential customers and clients, just asking them, what would you want from my product or my service or whatever. And unfortunately, a lot of people don't think to do that.
No, they don't.
On the other hand, large corporations spend thousands, if not millions of dollars trying to get the right research, but probably do it in a way that they're not getting the meaty information that they really need.
Yeah. I was once doing a lot of work for one of the largest multinational groups in the world. And at the last count, they had at least 140 different companies under their wing. And one day the chairman rang me up and he said, I'm sick and tired of having board meetings and getting my managing directors from my various divisions coming in here and giving me a report and telling me what I already know. You see? And I said to him, so? And he said, well, do something about it for me, will you? So I gathered all these managing directors together and I said, this is what the old man's saying, what about it? And they would say things like, well, how would we know what he doesn't know? I said, have you thought of asking him? And they said, you can't do that. It makes us look foolish. And I said, now why would it do that? You are trying to solve his problem by not giving him information he already knows. The best way to do that is to ask him, what does he want to know and what doesn't he want to know? No, they weren't going to do it. I said, all right, well, don't do that. Phone his PA, she knows more about running the group than he does anyway, and ask her. And they wouldn't even do that, so I rang her up. And I had a chat with her. She said, oh, that's not a problem, anytime. And so the next board meeting was coming up, and I rang her up and I said, by the way, and we had about 12 directors that had to present on that occasion. And I went through all 12 and I said, does he know about this? Yes. Does he know about that? No. So we got it sorted. And having done that, they then put their reports together, but they also added an addendum paper in case you need more detail on something you already know, here it is, right? But they didn't address it. And the chairman was served to bits. For the first time in his life, he was actually getting through a board meeting a hell of a lot faster than he normally did. And of course, the bosses of the companies weren't getting shot down in flames because he'd interrupt them. They carefully rehearsed their presentation and he'd say, I know that, move on. And well, that's not that easy if you're not used to doing it. So now they didn't have to do that. And so people get the idea that if you mustn't ask because it makes you look silly. The intelligent person asks, not the other one. And so if you're not sure, ask, find out. It saves you a lot of grief in life.
Well, it does, and I must admit at school I didn't like asking questions because I thought it'd be seen to be a fool by my peers.
Yes, that's where I got it from too. Yeah.
And, but when I went into my own business when I was about 25, I suddenly realised the only way I was going to find out was to ask.
Yes.
And I'd go to seminars, I'd go to meetings, I'd have meetings with people and just keep on asking.
Yes.
And I was reticent, particularly people that were higher level or perceived in my view. I'd go in fear and trepidation. But I found they were just like you and me.
Exactly, that's precisely
and quite happy to help if you went with the right attitude.
That's right.
But the interesting thing is, a few years ago, as you're aware, that I did quite a few seminars with tax people and customs, and we were actually planning some seminars around Australia and this group of industry and custom speakers, and we had a 2-day session in Canberra, and the lady involved, very smart lady, Nicole, and she said, well, look, I'll do the presentation that you guys will be doing, but you be the audience and ask questions as I'm going through, except for you, Lance, because you asked too many questions. So now I've gone the other way, you see.
But that's okay. It's better to do that than
but it is.
To sit,
And I came out, we had a guy there from VeriSign. Now, if you go on the internet, you'll see VeriSign everywhere because there's secure payments and secure systems. And with this new system with customs, you have to have a digital certificate. And part of the process is getting that digital certificate, which is a bit of a process. But I was asking, because this whole system was internet-based, and it basically meant anywhere in the world you can access the system. You don't have to be in Australia. So I said to this gentleman, if I was a Scottish store holder and I'd found boots, which are very warm boots and would go really well in the Highlands of Scotland, and I'm thinking, I'll be an importer of these things. The supply was in Bungendore down in Canberra, because I figured these people living in Canberra know where that was. So here's a supplier of this. But that person only wanted to sell. They weren't prepared to do all the export, get it down to the wharf and on the ship. That's all a hassle. He was just making. I said, so this Scottish entrepreneur decides he'll organise it, use a freight forwarder, But he wants to do his own export entry because he's Scottish. Like I'm Scottish, he wants to save some money.
Of course, quite right.
So he wants to get his own digital certificate, do his own customs entry, so he can save, $20 or $30. So how could he do that? And the guy said, well, up till recently he'd be able to do that, but now he'd actually have to come to Australia to verify who he was, get a 100-point check, and then be able to do it. He would be able to do it, but he couldn't do it by remote control.
Gee, that's a bore.
Well, it is. It seems counterproductive. But that was the answer. I accept that. But what happened after we had our session, there was these other people that were in the background there, sort of writing notes, and some of these were people that were contractors to Customs to develop educational programs for tutorials on how to apply for the system. A few of these people came up and collared me and said, how did you think of that scenario? I said, well, I just sort of put myself in a situation. I'm trying to think outside the box. And that's what I try to do these days, because you've got to try and solve problems, and that you can't solve the problems inside the box. You've got to get outside.
Absolutely right.
And they said, we'd like to talk to you. I'd open their mind to different scenarios that they needed to think about.
See, most of us tend to think about our point of view, our problems.
Exactly.
We don't reverse it, for example. We think, how can this poor wee Scots fella, how can he actually get what he wants? And we don't think in those terms. But if we did, then we'd either learn something ourselves or we'd be able to help him, one of the two. But that all comes down to the same thing. I was talking about these people who didn't want to look fools in front of the boss.
Yeah.
But the next step in the same sort of chain of events is being intimidated by superior people. And and I don't know how many boardrooms you've walked into, but I've lost count. I've worked with prime ministers and all sorts of things. I've even worked with Maggie Thatcher on the satellite.
Okay.
And God help me. But anyway, she wasn't a problem for me. But on the other hand, the position the person holds is what causes the power thing. And normally speaking, you will build around the power. So if you're going to see the chairman of a huge company, he will have a huge office with great views and genuine paintings on the wall. The thing that always amused me was a desk with nothing on it. Absolutely clear desk. I don't know how you do that if you're really meant to work. And then you've got to walk, quite a long way to get to his desk. And he's probably sitting there with his spectacles on the end of his nose, looking at you as though you're a piece of dirt. Now, that's more old-fashioned than it is today. But just the same, that's intimidating. But the more you work with them, the more you realise they're human beings just like you are. They have the same hopes, the same fears. Just because they happen to have a title doesn't mean to say they're not human.
No, exactly.
And so the minute you can learn that you don't need to be afraid of these people, that's all right for you to say, Geoffrey, because you don't get your pay packet from the boss. Well, that's fine, but I do, really. I mean, every time I work as a consultant to somebody, I'm dependent on them, but I don't think of them in those terms.
No, that's right.
I think I've got a job to do, and if I have to tell a Prime Minister he stuffed it, then that's my job. I try not to be terribly rude, but you see what I'm getting at.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not doing your job if you don't do it right. So after a while, you've got to teach yourself that you're not going in to see the chairman of something. You're going in to see a man who needs a bit of assistance. And I think the best way to sort of describe it, I don't know whether you've ever met somebody who used to be very high and mighty and powerful, and had the Bentley or the Jaguar or whatever it was, and a huge office and a staff and so on. Now they're retired. And now you meet them in the street.
Okay.
And they're totally different people. All the trappings have gone. And the same would apply if you were a Prime Minister and you were no longer a Prime Minister. I mean, you wouldn't know what to call him, would you really? I mean, you think, what, do I call you by your Christian name or your surname or do I call you Prime Minister? I mean, what do I do? So, but you don't have to do any of those things. It's no longer a problem. So you have to teach yourself that these people are human, just like you are, think just like you do, have hopes and fears like you do. I've had Prime Ministers who actually hated standing up in public. But as long as you talk to them about cameras, cattle, and Lancia motor cars, you were away. You had no problem at all. And I often used to do that, just to get him off or out of some situation he didn't want to be in. And sometimes you could tell, you'd just see him standing there. and not enjoying the conversation he's being forced into. And I usually wandered up to him and said, "Prime Minister, you're needed." And he'd say, "What?" And I'd say, "Well, you are. Follow me, please." You see, and off he goes. He said, "What's the matter?" I said, "You needed rescuing." You see? So as long as you recognise these people are human beings, that's fine. And you have to learn to treat them that way. You're going to feel a lot better. If you can only begin to do that, you'll feel a lot better, because you won't be intimidated anymore.
Just taking that point, Geoff, you've obviously met a lot of people in politics, but let's get more in the business realm, which you've had a lot of experience in. Do you find people don't want to be around yes people?
Generally, that's true, they don't.
I mean, a lot of people think people just want to be fed the pats on the back.
It's usually the junior, or the more junior manager will tend to think, "I don't think the boss would want to hear this." But if he's a good boss, he wants to hear it. In fact, that's one of the problems, surely, with every public service organisation in the world. Because right down at grassroots, where the public servant is dealing with the public, they get everything chucked at them. And then they pass that up to the next level and the next level. But at every level it gets filtered until eventually, right at the very top, you've got the head of the department, and he knows his minister or his senator or whatever, and he thinks, "Oh, I don't think I'll broach that subject today because I don't think he's going to be in the mood for that." And so they don't, or they do, but they tailor it. So how the heck can the poor bloke make a decision which has been so watered down on the way up? It's just ridiculous. So no, I've always said it like it is, and sure, they can argue with me, but that's up to them, But I'm telling it like I know it to be, and I may not be totally right, but on the other hand, I've got an ear to the ground that they don't have. So yeah, I think that's really important. I think the other thing that's very important about people and the way we think is beware of people's moods. The minute you're aware that we have moods, how often have you either wandered into an office or something like that and said good morning to the boss, and the boss has looked at you with the real daggers and said, and walked on and think, what have I done wrong? You probably haven't done anything wrong. He had a row with his wife this morning. He's just carried this on. I actually had a case like that. I was working for Granada Television in the UK, and I was taking the late night flight from Manchester down to London. In those days, a Vickers Viscount, a little, turboprop aeroplane. And we got on board, and the captain let the brakes go rather suddenly, and we jerked our way off towards the runway, and we roared up into the air. And when we got to London, he slammed it down on the ground, and he taxied in and slammed the brakes on, and it shuddered. And as I got off and I went down the steps, I said to the hostess waiting for us at the bottom, said, "What's the matter with the captain? Have a row with his wife or something?" She said, "How did you know?" Now, you're not supposed to do that as a captain of an aeroplane, are you? But on the other hand, you have to be so careful about moods. They're incredibly contagious. And stop blaming yourself for something that's probably got nothing to do with you. So that's something else about people that we all need to be aware of, I think. And if we're not, it's about time we did. Just don't worry about half these things. And don't worry about asking questions. And don't worry about all this business about the power that they're wielding. Unless he's got a sword in his hand or a gun in his hand, then you call him sir. But apart from that, you don't worry. So those things I think are really very important. What else is important in that area of human thinking, especially when fear's got something to do with it? Usually, a fear is related to a feeling of our own insecurity, usually. Because the minute you feel confident, you don't have the fears, do you? So what you have to do is use fear in order to discover what your problem is. And if you can do it, you suddenly get yourself into a situation and suddenly you're a bit afraid or anxious. You need to analyse why you're anxious. You go to a party, you don't know anybody, and you're suddenly feeling uncomfortable. Well, there's a message there, isn't there?
Yeah, that's right.
And the message is either you don't go to any more parties that you don't know anyone, or you do something about it. Why do I feel like this? My poor mother couldn't go into a room unless my father went in first. If there was something some group of people she didn't know, bless her heart, and she was an incredibly shy woman. Who suffered? She did. Nobody else did. She used to think, oh, they'll look at me. Half the time people don't. They don't take any notice when you walk into a room, unless you happen to be the king of somewhere or whatever, or a pop star or one of those things. Different matter. But generally speaking, you're just another member of the group. And it's a shame when you have that situation in your life and you're shy and so on and so forth. But you can use those things as a method of finding out something about yourself.
So talking about fear there, Geoff, we hear fear of failure, which most people would identify with that. We also hear of fear of success. Can you give us some examples possibly of both of those to give a bit of balance?
Yeah. Well, I think I said on a previous occasion, fear of failure, the only people I don't think ought to fail are airline pilots and ship's captains. But apart from that, I don't think anybody goes through life without making lots of failures. And the answer to that one also is that it's a learning thing. If you don't make mistakes, how the heck can you get it right? Almost always you've got to go through a learning curve, which means you're going to fail. Good bosses won't sack you for getting it wrong once. Maybe they might do it after you do it again, or again and again. But generally speaking, I haven't met anybody that hasn't failed. Take a look at any politician around the world and take a look at how often they've failed in public. And there are many other people who've done the same thing. So I think we worry too much about failing and see it as a learning situation rather than a failure. And the other one is to look at it in terms of, okay, I did this and this happened. So what I've just done is created myself an outcome. Now that's not the outcome I want, so let's try a different approach to this and see if I get a better outcome. And if you see it like that, now you're actively learning on how to change the feeling of failure into one of success. So that's another element you can use. One I use quite a lot actually. If I get it wrong, I think I better change the way I'm doing this because otherwise it's not going to work.
Sure.
When it comes to fear of success, that is real. And I know quite a lot of people who become very successful, often very quickly, and suddenly they're out of their depth. And I think one of the reasons for it's the same thing. The thing gets away from you. Your success is driving you now, you're not driving the success.
Sure.
And I can relate that back to my days either flying or sailing boats. There comes a time when you're learning these things when the aeroplane is actually flying you, because you're way behind the bloody 8 ball.
Like a dog walking you instead of you.
That's exactly right, yes. And you're thinking, I haven't got time to do this. And so you're worrying about the fact that you can't catch up. Well, I think the same applies to people who worry about success. They don't enjoy the success. I mean, I think I might have told you on a previous occasion about a bloke who was one of the co-inventors of Corningware. He'd gone from virtually just an average income into millions of dollars in his pocket. And now he was so afraid of losing his millions of dollars, he used to sit in a chair in the morning with a gin and tonic at his side and the telephone here, be constantly checking up on his stocks and shares and goodness knows what all. And I used to say to him, you've got to kill yourself doing this. You wouldn't go anywhere. He didn't eat very much. He was still, doing that. And in fact, that's what he did. He died far too young. I think he died in his 50s. And he didn't need to. In other words, success had taken over him. And I think you need to be able to teach yourself that success is just part of your life. And if you are successful, then start making that success of value to somebody else.
So for people that have that problem, that their success will fade away probably if they don't cope with that success. But what about, on the other hand, people that might achieve the success, struggle with it for a while? How do they overcome it? Have you had any experience like that?
Yeah, of people who struggled a long time to get where they got to, and then got there. In fact, that happens quite a lot. And it happens quite a lot in show business. We have suddenly this new star emerges. They've been at it for 15 years.
It's an overnight success.
That's right. They're not overnight successes at all. And of course, it can go to your head. There's no doubt about that. Suddenly, overnight, you're worth an awful lot of money. And usually that's what dictates it. Money and fame, those two things tend to go together. So you first of all have a lot of money, and secondly, you're recognised now, and you're very famous. Both of them have got big catches attached to them. There was a time when I was nationally known in Australia, and it doesn't matter where I went. People say, "G'day, Geoff, how you going, mate?" Even happened in London one day. I'm walking down the street. "No, good day, Geoff. What are you doing over here?" All that sort of thing.
Sure.
But you have, with that situation, you've got to learn to wear it. I was let off pretty lightly, but some of these film stars, get themselves into all sorts of pickles. But just the same, you've got to learn to wear it because you can't escape it. So you might as well enjoy the process as opposed to going down another track. Money is a different matter, I think, and you've got to be careful who you get to help you manage the money that you've now got, because you can do some good with that money. You don't need it all. I had a dear old father-in-law once who used to say to me, "I don't know why you need 2 cars. I haven't got one." And he was actually very well off. He used to say, "You can only drive 1 car, wear 1 suit and eat 1 meal at a time." And I used to say, "Yes, you're right." But on the other hand, it depends on your circumstances, and when you're in show business, you've got to put on an act. Because, if I drove up to the BBC in a beat-up old Volkswagen, you know what people would do. They'd say, "Is that all he can afford? He can't be very good." Do you see? They make the connection. So you've got to overplay it a bit. But it shouldn't go to your head. The minute that success really goes to your head, either financial or otherwise, you've got a problem. And it does with some people. When they just go through the money or they sort of want to hang on to it, one of the two. But if you're calm and collected about it, it really shouldn't change your life too much. I've been both rich and poor.
Well, you've never really been poor. You might have been broke.
Broke, yes, you're right,
poor.
actually. Yes, no, I was never poor.
Because John, my colleague, and I, we've at times had situations like that. Yes. We said, "Yeah, we don't have any money at the moment. We might be broke at this particular day,
right. Yes,
but we're not poor because we're rich in our."
You're quite right about that. Yes, I used the wrong word. I've been broke, more than once. But you're right about being poor. Yeah. And that raises another issue with people. They're constantly looking for some kind of success, but they don't realise they're living in the middle of some success already. Exactly. You take us here. There's a roof over our heads. We've had tea and coffee and a pleasant lunch and so on. We've eaten today.
Correct.
All
very
those
nice
things.
It was too.
Yeah, and all those things we take them for granted. And there are trees and birds out there and all the rest of it. There is a lot to be gained from seeing wealth in other things apart from money. And you've got people that you know that are nice to be with and so on and so forth. And that's really wealth.
Well, you're really saying success is a journey, not a destination.
Oh, absolutely. No question about that. Yes, and I think the further down the journey you go, the more you change. I can remember having to work my tail off when you're bringing up kids. I don't have to work my tail off anymore. And I have no reason to go and buy big flash cars either. Or go out to, posh restaurants. I don't need to do that anymore, so I don't. So you change as time goes on. And I think that's probably a good thing. And I think you also teach you how to deal with adversity, because you go through these things in your life, and you need to learn how to handle that. And that's something else, but maybe for another time, I suppose.
Well, just before we close this session, who would be your top 3 mentors?
Oh, not too difficult, really. One has to be Churchill, because I spent so much time with him, and I still use him. It's not difficult. He's a very easy man to get advice from, even though he's gone to God. And I just say to myself, I'm faced with this situation, what would you do about it? And then you say, get off your butt and push through, or don't give in, or something like that. And I think that's a great piece of advice. In other words, don't do nothing, because doing nothing is a decision, by the way. Get out and do something. Take some action about the thing. So he's certainly one. I think Dick Smith is another one, because Dick has had his ups and downs through life, but he's turned out to be a very nice and successful multi-millionaire. And I think he's used his money very wisely. He's helped a lot of other people. And lots of people have done that, but just the same, he's been through the rough end of it, and he knows what it's like. And I think Janine Shepherd would be my third, because she's had such a rough time. And I think under those circumstances, you can only but admire them. So I think I'd put those as in my top 3 if I had to. But there's probably lots of others that I've missed.
Sure.
Like a bunch one day, I had to go and present some awards to a bunch of quadriplegics and paraplegics in this big hotel. And I got the flu. And I was driving up there and I was thinking, what am I going to do this for? I feel like, dreadful. I want to go home to bed. God, dear. And I was really cursing, carrying on. And I parked the car, I felt lousy, and as I walked in, I thought, I shouldn't be here. What do they want me for? And I walked in, and there are all these people who can't walk, some of them from the neck down paralysed, laughing and carrying on. And I thought, Geoffrey, how dare you feel sorry for yourself? Because now you're confronted with a situation. I'm nothing, I've just got a bit of flu, that's all I've got. But look at these people. And they can go through that, and they can be happy, bright and cheerful. And that's what I think we should all be doing more.
They're successful people, aren't they?
They're successful people.
Yeah.
Very successful.
They're living
people.
success.
Yeah, absolutely they are. Yeah, mind you, they have their downtimes as well. But then we all do.
Exactly.
But, on that occasion, they were the happy ones and I wasn't. And boy, I've never forgotten that. I reckon it's been good for me.
I think I've had some reality check moments myself.
Yeah, that's right. I guess we all have.
Great. Well, thanks, Geoff.
That's a pleasure.
It's been great talking with you.
Yeah, and you too.
Okay.
Bye.
Well, that brings us to the end of our interview with Geoff Stone on the characteristics of success. I truly hope you've gained something positive out of it. This has been another edition of Down Under the Radar. As we finish our time together, let me remind you of the Chinese proverb which says, unless we change our direction, we're likely to end up where we're headed. Think about it. This is Lance School of the Savvy Navigator signing off. Keep positive, follow your dreams, and most of all, keep smiling. Bye now.